All right, everybody, welcome to season 2 premiere of the Cyber Talent Matrix. We are kicking off this season with a deep dive into the most critical data hitting the industry right now. Last week at the RSA conference in San Francisco, SANS and GIAC released their 2026 Cybersecurity Workforce Research Report. It's a document that confirms what we've been feeling on the ground. The talent shortage is evolving into a complex management and skills crisis. I'm Jeff Welgan, joined by my co hosts Dr. Sasha Vanterpool and Will Denman. Today, we have a very special guest to help us navigate this data, Brian Correia, Director of Business Development at SANS GIAC. Brian, welcome to the Matrix.
Well,
Thanks so
thank you for having me. So appreciate that and appreciate the kind words about the workforce report that got released last week. So I will confess it's a bit of a passion project of ours. So it's something I developed because everybody talked about the headcount gap problem here in cybersecurity. But to me, I wanted to lift the hood up and see what was underneath that headcount gap. And I always felt like there was so much more behind those numbers. And in some ways, those numbers kind of gave a false narrative. So, I'll admit a little bit of the guiltiness of this project was, hey, let's hear from cyber talent managers, is what I call them. So they're either people that do the hiring, retainment, recruitment of cyber talent. They could head up security teams, they could be HR, they could be a couple different things. They could head up training. But the one thing they had in common was hiring, retainment. They were somehow involved with the workforce. And I wanted to have something where they talk to each other. So, one thing I always want to make sure to kind of emphasize is this was built by managers for managers. So it was actually not built by practitioners. So, some of the numbers that you see, some of the things that you'll see on this were built by managers for managers. But the idea was, hey, they had something that they could understand what the market was doing. They could also see the trends, but it's also something they could take to their bosses, right? Of, hey, here's what's going on in the industry. This is what's changing. This is the year we've done it. I will admit, like, we're far from perfect. We keep learning every year we do it, but I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit biased. I think we're getting better and better at it each year that we do it. I think the one thing that probably surprised us more than anything was how quickly things were changing in this industry. Like, I never in my wildest dreams expected that we were going to see such big changes from year one to year two to year three. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on year 4, year 5, year 6. But, I love the cyber community. I've been in this community now for 25 years. Like, I've always considered this to be part of my family. So for me, this is a little bit of like a kind of something that I'm trying to give back to the community.
well, we're super excited to talk about the report and congratulations to the team and to your contributors for doing this, third year in a row. We find the value and the data really important and very intriguing, especially as we kind of see those changes that you mentioned. So I'm excited to kind of dive down deeper into some of the research. Was one of the first things I wanted to kind of talk about was this big shift. You kind of alluded to it from last year to this year. We're noticing that we're going from this not enough staff to not the right skills shift. Um, I think in the previous report that not enough staff to not the right skills was only a 4-point difference. But that gap has now exploded to a 20-point difference, with 60% of organizations citing their skills gap as their primary challenge. So, with that, in your conversations with all these global leaders and really great customers, both on the government side and commercial side, are they actually feeling fully staffed but just underskilled? Or are they finally realizing that adding more people to a broken system doesn't necessarily move the needle? Or are there other factors at play here that we should be chatting about?
Yeah. So it was interesting when we did the first year, no surprise, headcount was the number one thing. So we were surprised on year 2 when it suddenly shifted. And now it was, hey, it's our staff doesn't have enough skills. And it was a 4-point gap, right? So people are still noting that they have a headcount gap problem. But this year, it kind of exploded a little bit and it was a 20-year gap. Now it's going to be interesting to see year 4 and year 5. I mean, people are still saying, yes, I still have a shortage of employees, but I think people are realizing more and more. hey, I can throw as many employees as I can into the problem. It's still not going to fix it if those employees don't know or don't have the skills to be able to do it, right? Are they efficient? Are they effective? And so it is interesting to see. And as you dive into the study, you start seeing more and more. And Jeff, I know you have the statistics, so I'm going to hold off on some, but it does explain a little bit of now we've lifted the hood up and why are people seeing that and what are they seeing that's changing everything?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Will, or you have anything you want to add to that? It looks like you're kind of wanting to chime in a little bit here, so I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, part of me is like the study hits on this quite a bit. But again, part of me wonders how much is done by AI, right? I think a lot of people sometimes are kind of like tired of talking about AI, but when it comes to this, when it comes to the skills gap, like first of all, we're having this broad increase in a company's attack surface, especially if people are using AI agents, stuff like that. And of course, like cloud environments might be getting more increasingly complex and things of that sort. And so I just find it interesting that, this skills gap could also be, not only just I don't know, there's new emerging technology, but now it's the attack surface has grown. And then on top of that, because I was doing some notes on this, I'm going, there's an intersection between, if we're putting AI agents or something of that sort into the, infrastructure of a, team's processes, in whatever part of the business that may be, all of a sudden you need to know about, X thing. And then you need to know enough about AI to kind of, mesh the two in a way that kind of doubles the skills gap there. And so part of me, again, there's a lot of what is AI's impact in the study that I'm just like, oh, I'm super hyped to get into. Um, but yeah, I was like, that was a big thing. I don't know. Brian, do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, so we actually did a whole section and asked a whole series of questions on AI to try to better, especially because, like you said, Will, like everybody talks about AI, AI. Like the joke was try to find a vendor at RSA that doesn't talk about AI at their booth. So some of the interesting statistics that came out of this is only 20% actually even have AI training comprehensive within their organization. So while everybody talks about AI, AI is still very, very new in organizations. One thing that really surprised me is AI governance. And so people are just now starting to talk about this. And that is how do you use AI properly? Because, I remember doing a presentation at SHRM and I turned to the audience of HR managers and I said, where do you think AI gets its information from? And most people in the audience were like, I don't know. And I said, well, it pulls from the World Wide Web. It pulls from places like Twitter. It pulls places like LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, everything on the World Wide Web is correct, right? And everybody started laughing, right? Like Twitter is always perfect, right? Um, with that, there is some interesting things with AI where it does have some bias because once again, it's, AI, remember, doesn't think, right? It's just pulling from the information that exists. So what was interesting was only 21% actually even have an AI governance plan. So the question is, and look at, I'm the last person out there that wants to have 50 million rules, but what it tells you is, hey, people are using AI a lot of times kind of unofficially, what we always call shadow over here, shadow AI, where people are using AI on their own, but nobody's given them any training. They've never told them how or what they can use it for, things along those lines. I mean, maybe a funny example is the Walt Disney Company actually sued because they were using some company was using the Mickey Mouse characters and Donald Duck and stuff like that for unofficial posters on copyrighted material. Where that gets funny is Disney internally themselves ended up using the same form of AI on producing posters for Disneyland that they got caught on. So, but nobody sat down with them, even internally, and said, this is how you can use AI. This is how you should use AI. Like some of the things is they say, you don't want any confidential information, right? That's put into AI. You want to make sure that's like if it's anything political, bias, anything like that, you want to make sure, if nothing else, you want to make sure to be very, very careful. I always say with AI, you always want a human double check a lot of times, right? I think it's very important to use AI, but it has some interesting things. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of this, at least with AI, was hey, there's a series of jobs that are starting to shrink because AI's taken that over. What's a little bit scary about that is a lot of those are the entry level jobs, which of course scares you a little bit because how are we building that pipeline?
Right.
However, I always try to explain that AI isn't, to me, this is no different than when farming became, it went from humans doing it to machines doing it. It was no different than, like, for example, when PCs happened, when Microsoft Office, it didn't actually kill the workforce, right? Because there's a lot of talk of today of like, my job's going to be gone, AI is going to take it over. I don't believe that's true. But what I do believe is true is it's a shift of the jobs. And the report actually talks about all these new AI jobs and how they're growing, even down to like an AI engineer. Now, the interesting thing is people can't find those folks today because they didn't exist 5 years ago. Like, sometimes the joke was HR managers were saying, "Hey, we included job recs that said, I need an AI security engineer with 5 years or above of work experience." Well, there is nobody with 5 years of work experience in this industry. So it's still very, very new. But yeah, so Will, to your point, AI is very much changing this. I would say there's like 3 or 4 different things that are changing this workforce quite a bit. But AI very much is, I would say, ground zero of just changing things left and right and moving it around. And it's changing it very quickly. But to me, what also it said is, hey, people are still very, even though everybody talks about it, people are still very, very early on how to use AI, the way I should use AI, things along those lines. So, I mean, I'd love to hear your point of views, but, we definitely kind of delved into that. And the report goes even a little bit more deeper of like even what tools people are using and things along those lines. But I thought it was fascinating like, in some ways, I was surprised, but not surprised, if that makes sense, of some of the numbers, at least with AI.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about it too. I want to circle back just real quick to this headcount skills gap point as well. I think there is a real tangible feel, right, for organizations when they're talking about their employees, their cybersecurity talent, and the desire to have the right skills, and maybe a mismatch of, hey, our employees aren't showing the right skills, or we need different skills. Um, but just to play a little bit of a controversial devil's advocate here, I would say that some of the blame isn't necessarily on the employees, but on the employers themselves, right? I see a lot of employers who don't actually define what skills they really want. So they'll bring employees in and they'll criticize that they don't have the right skills, but don't really have the due diligence on the front end to say, hey, these are the skills we actually want. And, let's quantify exactly how proficient we should be in those particular, types of skills for these types of roles. So, um, I don't know if you see any of that, Brian, or what your take is on that. But I think personally, I think it's a two-way accountability problem, both on the employee and on the employer.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So these employers, the managers themselves, they're pretty critical of themselves at times. I mean, it pops itself up multiple times in the survey. But one thing that I thought was really interesting was, so just like the skills versus headcount, there was a thing on there of when you're hiring, what is the biggest factors you're looking for? So year one, no surprise, work experience, right? But what surprised us on year two was technical capability took over. Now, technical capability could represent a couple different things, but what that meant was somebody was qualified they met like maybe 80% of the qualifications of that job. Not 100%, but 80%. But they had the technical capability to get them the rest of the 20%. That actually became number one in year two. In year three, that number just continued growing. In other words, work experience started dropping down a little bit, technical capability started increasing. And so sometimes I always use the example of, hey, everybody wants to hire LeBron, right? He's the best, basketball player out and things along those lines, but there's only one LeBron, right? So in our industry, it's always been, hey, can I find a top? Can I find a top and take it from there? But what I think people are realizing over time is not only is there only so many of those, they may still not fit with your culture, right? That was something else that popped up was you needed someone that fit in your culture. Some of the other things that popped up was, hey, some of the best people to hire are from within your own organization, right? Find those future stars and bring them on board. And so it really talked about, so what you're starting to see is people, the way that they're thinking of hiring is starting to change more and more and more. One thing that was a little bit surprising, or maybe not surprising, was as the years are going on, cyber managers and CISOs are doing more of the hiring. HR is, HR is involved, but they're taking a little bit less of a role as the years are going on, where the cyber managers are literally kind of taking the lead of that. But I thought that technical capability was a very fascinating fact to see on there of that, hey, people are realizing, and I think Jeff, because they don't have very detailed job descriptions, they realize they can't find someone that has 100%. And I think as the industry grows, people are becoming more specialized, right? So if I have a job that I'm looking for a pen tester, forensics analyst, a CISO, and security architect all in one, those people don't really exist. Or if they do exist, it's so very few of them out there in the marketplace, right? Like I call them unicorns. There's only so many unicorns out there, right? And if anything, I think this industry has probably more unicorns than any other place I've ever known. But I think a lot of it comes down to, and I think this is what's interesting about the report is we have to remember this industry is still very, very young, right? Like sometimes I think people don't realize, when people say, what's the future of cybersecurity in the workforce? I say, just look at medical, look at some other industries. They got like 100 years ahead of us, right? Like those things didn't happen overnight. I think this industry is evolving quicker, but you're starting to see some of those patterns come over, right? A doctor typically these days is not just a doctor, they're an econologist, you're a pediatrician, there's something, right? And so, Jeff, I think people don't know how to write job descriptions because they don't know what to put in them. And that's where this whole technical capability, but I think they're also realizing I'm not going to find somebody with 100% of those skills. And so, what do I need to do? And it's interesting because some of the larger organizations, the ones that you would think, Amazon's probably a good example. Amazon, I'm sure, gets a million resumes. Everybody wants to work for Amazon, right? AWS. They have a cyber hospital concept where they take what they've done in the doctoral and bring that over into cybersecurity, right? Where you're a resident, where you have chances to practice, things along those lines. I mean, Amazon's doing that, knowing that Amazon can kind of get the top of the pick, right? What does that say about other organizations? And so one thing that I thought was interesting was we're starting to see mentorships really increasing quite a bit of, hey, when people come in the door, what am I doing to help them grow and take it from there? And so, you know, you're starting to see certain trends that are really starting to pop up more and more and more and more all the time of, and one thing that was maybe one last one is because I'd love to hear from the rest of you was career paths actually was like, how do I retain people? No surprise, salary number one, right? But what was interesting was career paths was in eighth place last year. It jumped to third. It went from like it tripled. In other words, one of the complaints in our industry is we bring someone in the door, we have no path for them. We have no place for them to grow. So eventually what's happening is these people are walking out the door because they're getting another offer which gives them a chance to do that. Now maybe they're stuck again, but then they'll leave again. And it starts this vicious cycle where there's no path for these people to go from ground zero to grow within a company itself. And that's not coming from the practitioners, that's coming from the managers. So that's I think a good example where managers are kind of themselves going, yeah, we've kind of let the workforce down when we're building it. So I mean, I'd
Yeah,
love to hear
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
your
I
experience in
actually
that
want to
area.
bring Sasha's voice in here. We haven't got a chance to hear from you today yet, Sasha. So why don't you take it away with something?
Yeah, I mean, man, Brian, you brought up so many good points there. But I think just to your last point, something I'm definitely very passionate about is those career paths, like you're saying. I think there's so much that goes into that. I think it's a little bit of what we were talking about with the job descriptions being crappy, but also just the leaders not being really clear on what the expectations are for what they're looking for, or being so focused on trying to find that unicorn. So when they're hiring people, they aren't looking from within. They aren't looking and giving people opportunities for lateral moves to go from one team to another, or trying to develop those junior people and provide them with the training that they need, and being able to say like, hey, this is how you can grow, and these are the career pathways that we have for you to stay within our company. We want to retain you, we want to develop you, and we want you to stay here, instead of jumping from company to company, kind of like what you were saying. So that's something that I just feel often happens. I think the past conversations have been about, this hiring gap and the talent shortage and all of that. And we kind of forget about those who are actually working in the field, and those kind of mid level, and how do we develop them to senior level, or even the junior folks? How do we get them once they have a job
Yeah, and
into
even Sasha,
mid level? Hmm.
I was gonna say even hiring, it popped itself up. It had a very big of like, what are the methods for me to be able to hire people? And
Yeah.
career paths skyrocketed this year in this workforce report of, hey, and this is coming from managers themselves. This is
Hmm.
not coming
Hmm.
from the everyday person going, hey, people are asking questions now of what happens when I walk in the door? Where do I go from here? So
Exactly.
I don't believe that really happened here in the
But isn't
past.
that interesting
It
though? Like this point that you have like a career pathing. I'm just bringing it up because it's interesting. Career
Sure,
pathing is important, but the data is also saying we're not hiring younger or new or junior people, right? We're targeting more senior or senior mid senior roles, right? So
true.
what is the length of the path that these folks are really hoping for when we've kind of set aside a lot of the junior talent and are focusing on the mid to senior level. Like, is everybody just aspiring to be a leader or a CISO or a BISO? I don't expect you to have an answer to that, Brian. I'm just pointing it out. It's like, that's an interesting thing. And feel like there's a little bit of a conflict there to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. And I think our industry, part of the reason why you've seen the stats change so quickly is because it's trying to figure it all out.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it realizes it has some problems, right? Like to me, I have to admit, like I did a presentation about a year and a half ago with people that were straight out of college. And they kept saying, hey, I joined cybersecurity because I thought I was going to have 40 job offers when I left. And I've been out of work for a full year and I can't figure out how to break into this industry. And everybody told me that this place was going to have like amazing jobs. And that's why I selected your industry.
That was the
And it
promise.
was tough to be able to sit
Yep.
there and say, I don't know if people really told you the truth. Like, my belief in some ways is IT is a really good you start off in IT and then you build your way into cybersecurity is sometimes a really good pathway. But, even silly things of like, join ISSA, do networking, get yourself out, do cyber ranges, do things that will help you to kind of network in the audience. Like they had never thought about that. They didn't even know it existed for them to be able to do. like Jeff, some of the work that you do, and for all three of you, like they just didn't even know, like things like WeSees, they just didn't even know that even existed. Nobody, they were taught a lot, but nobody ever told them about all these great resources that exist in the community that I kind of stood there and go, InfoCard, the list goes on. Did you go to the B-sides? Have you tried that? SANS has got 1 million. I had to plug a little SANS. Like I said, we have 1 million free resources. We have opportunities to network. Did you even realize? And they were like, no, I never knew that. Because I said, even walking in the door and saying, look I did the SANS, our holiday hack challenge. I may not have come in first place, but I did it. Like to me, that adds credibility to these individuals. And so, but it is true that when you look at the study, the reality is, and I can't take credit for it, but CyberSeek, I remember turning to them one day and said, hey, how many of these jobs are new versus how many of these jobs require experience? And it was over 80% require experience. I mean, the number was probably closer to 90%. Nobody ever told those college kids that story. And so, to me, the question is lifting up the hood. How do we get better at this? Right. And how do we better give the perception of what this industry is?
Mhm. And how do we
Uh,
give people the opportunity to gain that experience to develop those skills? Because, we're talking about the skill shortage, but then it's like when training budgets are the first thing to get cut, how are employees actually able to develop their skills that they do have to do their job properly, or if they have their eye on a different team, or they want to progress into a leadership role, and they don't even have the funding or the opportunities to be able to develop those skills, or to your point, Brian, they don't even know about the free resources that are available, or how to join a community to be able to network and to get some mentorship or job shadowing, apprenticeships, all these different, skills-based opportunities that do exist, but are definitely, harder to either come by, or people just don't know enough about them, or it's just harder for those partnerships to come into place so people can actually gain that experience to develop those skills.
And since we're talking about like hiring, I would love to kind of add probably the most exciting thing to cybersecurity to this discussion is regulatory compliance. That's a joke.
for some
um,
people,
for some people,
some
it's super
people would
exciting.
say,
But Brian, you guys did have some really good findings on that component, right?
Yeah, I thought that was
That
interesting.
yeah, regulatory compliance like NIS2, CMMC, DORA, 8140. That's impacting hiring decisions, which is a big jump from last year's report. You want to take a moment to kind of explain some of those stats and give some perspective on that?
yeah. So I'll be honest, we didn't start asking that question until last year. And if
Mm.
you would ask me what number that was going to come in at, I mean, I actually got criticized internally for even asking the question because everybody assumed that the number was going to be so low. We were just going to say it doesn't even make sense to put it in the. So we were surprised when last year. So the question was, um, the big question was, hey, is this regulatory changes? And we listed out the ones, Jeff, that you just talked about, and then a couple others, is affecting your hiring practices and your workforce. I thought it was 10%. It came in at 40% last year. So this year, like my one regret of last year was this year I made sure to ask additional questions because we only asked that one question because we just assumed it was going to not be all that high to begin with. So we asked that same question this year. It jumped to 95%, which is insane. I
Yeah.
mean, the funny thing is there's no room for growth on that one. I mean, it could go maybe up to 100. Is about as far as it's going to go. But to me, what's interesting about the regulatory landscape is you still have to realize things like NIS2, DORA, what you're seeing with CMC, these are all still very, very, very brand new mandates. CMC just went live, what, last November? November 2025, right? So to see like NIS2 is, for any critical infrastructure organization that's doing business in one of the EU countries. So there's 27 of them, but each country has to sign off on that. To this day, it's getting upwards of, it's more than half at this point. It's starting to approach 2/3. But, that some of that's like literally just happened. Like countries have been signing up even as of like January, February of this year. So all of this stuff is still brand new. Because sometimes I always explain that NIST 2, I do believe, could become the standard for critical infrastructure organizations in a similar format to, say, GDPR. But the secret of GDPR, which is a privacy rule, right? Which is you have to follow certain practices, blah, blah, blah. People assume that GDPR existed one day and the whole universe completely changed. No, it took like 10 years. It was a slow, as it grew and grew and grew, and even as countries. But what GDPR did, which also came out of the EU, is it became the standard for the whole world, right? Because anybody that was doing business in Europe had to meet that requirement. And it wasn't like companies turned around and said, I'm going to have one privacy rule for Europe, one privacy rule for the US, right? Once it existed, it became their policy within their organization across the board. I do see some of these regulations no different, which is, hey, they're going to be built into those organizations, and they're going to be built in where, hey, that's going to change their whole policies, their whole practices across the board. They're not going to stand there and go, I'm going to have one practice of how we do things in Europe, and I'm going to have another practice of how we're going to do it in, say, Japan, for example. That now becomes the standard for around the world. So I have to admit, the regulatory landscape, how quickly that's changing, is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. But I think it surprised me of like how quickly that's grown, how it's impacting. And I mean, still to this day, I'm a little surprised that number is not closer to 10%. So, I mean, trust me, we had to go back to that number a couple times to make sure that number was even correct. Because we're like, how did this happen? And how did it happen? So, but people are also looking like audits. Like one of the questions out there was, hey, are you now looking at skills validation of your workforce? Does that matter? And that number also increased. But, things are popping up now of audits. So how do I validate my workforce for auditing purposes? Cyber insurance is another one, right? In the old days, I think insurance policy folks thought that they could just write these great policies. They would make a ton of money, and the profit margins on these suckers were going to be great. Well, then a whole bunch of breaches started happening and bad things, and then people started cashing out their policies, and then they said, uh-oh. So now, just like when you get your if you have a car insurance,
There's a
they
lot to
start
do to
asking
get that
questions.
that policy. Yeah.
Yeah. It just doesn't happen. But sometimes, so I always think of, if you go back to the Great Depression, the reason why you saw audits in the financial industry was because nobody was checking those books, right? And so the things like the New York Stock Exchange, where they got smart for shareholders, is they said, hey, the board and the C-suite are responsible for those numbers. What did that do? That required people to now bring in, say, third parties and now validate those. And so now you're also getting boards and C-suites that are suddenly, like, sometimes I always say, we're now being brought into the C-suites. We're now being brought into board meetings that never existed 5 years ago. Sometimes now one of our biggest challenges is, hey, this industry, we've all talked so technical. We've never had to walk into the big boss, big boss, top of big boss, all the way to the top, and walking in those rooms and starting to have to answer questions. And how do we answer those questions that people can understand? But those are some examples right there where that regulatory landscape is, I mean, can you imagine some techie walking in a room for the first time with a bunch of, the board of a major corporation? Like, talking about a little scary right away. So we've actually started doing presentations over here at SANS of like, how do you talk to a board? How do you talk to the C-suite? Like, what are the type of things? What do they care about? What do they not care about? But that stuff started popping up in the workforce report of, hey, not only are these directives changing like how you're hiring and stuff like that, it's changing practices, how they're looking at cybersecurity. Like consulting firms are using skills validation to back up. Why should you hire me versus the competition, right? That never existed here necessarily in the past. But a lot of things are starting to, and in some ways, I would say just look at the financial industry and what they did. And some of that's popping itself over here in cybersecurity. It's just, you have to take the Wayback Machine, and they only have what, about 100 years ahead of us?
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think there was a big like trend with like just because you were reminding me of there's this huge trend with soft skills and things of that sort, right? And again, like communication, kind of especially like tech to non-tech people is just growing tenfold. Part of me kind of wonders though when we go back to the broader conversation of regulatory like requirements and kind of especially like it seemed like 2025 was this huge gauntlet of just new things kind of coming out and stuff. It almost is like, well, is this kind of an inevitable growth step, right? Because we're seeing things like with, again, you had the section frameworks as organizational blueprints. I have it like pulled up right now because it's a great piece of information, but we're seeing like, oh, well, these frameworks can, essentially help with like clear job requirements, better assessment criteria, things of that sort. And it's almost this, I'm not going to say forced adoption, but it's almost like hey, we're kind of pushing these people to go and do that. And obviously, the broader industry is kind of in this pressure cooker on all sides. I'm like every thing we keep talking about, there's either some kind of like contradiction or there's like this is the reason why people are feeling so much pressure whether it's entry level or senior. And so part of me goes and I'm saying like this big regulatory wave that's going to hit us, it feels almost inevitable. I'm just wondering if there's like anything you have to say about that because again it has its broad positive impacts on the organization as well. We talk about how difficult it may be to adopt right now because we're in the adopting phase of a lot of different things. But I thought that was kind of an interesting deal, right? Is like there is a lot of benefits to it too, you know
Yeah, I mean, anything regulatory always has some pros and it always has some cons to it, right? Like nothing is ever 100% perfect, right? But, sometimes what I always say is, hey, like SANS doesn't control regulations. We don't endorse or not endorse. We're not in that business. But these regulations are happening ready or not, right? Like we're having to learn to adapt to them. But in some ways when people say, "Well, how do I justify my workforce?" And I always say there's great frameworks. So to me there's two different types. So you got what I consider the process frameworks, right? You got the NIST cybersecurity framework, well known in the industry. You have the Center for Internet Security, the controls, the CIS controls. You have things like MITRE, for example, with a MITRE attack. Those are industry well known, right, frameworks of, hey, it will at least give you something to say, I'm using the best practices of the industry out there. Now, you also have, so Sasha, I know that you talked about, hey, job descriptions, and nobody seems to know what to put in there. So you're starting to see, and it's a gradual, like I will admit, it's not an overnight, it's not like regulatory where it just changed overnight, which is you have these workforce frameworks where there's now divided into jobs. And I will admit, people debate all the times of, you know, is that person a pen tester? Are they vulnerability assessment assessor? Like, what do we call them? How are they? However, what's nice about those workforce frameworks is it's starting to build a standard no different than other industries. So if somebody wants to, and I use sometimes the example of COVID, when suddenly medical and retail had to work more closely together, right? To how do you distribute, if they both have two different job descriptions of what that is. I mean, I can tell you organizations like Cisco and Amazon and Microsoft are so mammoth, they have multiple security teams. they also had multiple descriptions of the same role that were built in multiple different ways. So what you're starting to see is, hey, we're getting better at that. We're by far not perfect, but like even things like Department of Defenses or Department of War, that'll take me about 20 years just because I'm still trying to, when you've had in your mind all those years. But Department of War, like they have their 8140 mandate, right? That requires anybody in the military that deals with cybersecurity or IT to actually meet all these different job roles. That includes contractors, civilians, and troops. And but that starts becoming a standard. So if I'm a big Department of Defense contractor, but I also do stuff with the commercial marketplace and things like that, once again, I'm not going to develop one policy for Department of War and one policy for everybody else. I'm going to just develop one policy that now covers everyone. So you're starting to see where all that stuff, like the nice framework, I have to admit, and workforce frameworks. The first year we did the number was so low, we almost talked about not publishing it. I will confess. And to the credit, because I think everybody here knows, we approached Rodney Peterson on it. And he said, no, I want us to publish that number because he said, we can't grow that number if we don't talk about that number. But what was surprising was year 1 to year 2, that number increased by 10%. Year 2 to year 3, that number increased by another 10%. So what you're seeing is that, it's not, I would say it's drastic like regulatory, but that number is 10% each year, 10%, 10%, 10% starts making a huge impact. One thing I thought that was a little surprising was the European skills framework has really taken off. If you would ask me why, I would say it's all tied into, so maybe I'm wrong on this one, but my theory is it's all tied into the European regulations. So because of NIS2, because of DORA, because of stuff like that, that has kind of definitely worked its way through the system. So, to me, I think it's
And that framework
fascinating.
is also like really like I don't want to say simple because I'm not calling it simple, right? But it's pretty straightforward and it's not hard to use or adapt or adopt, I should say, for an organization. Where like if you look at the 8140 or I'm sorry, the Department of War's DCWF, right? A lot more
Okay, so I'm
complex.
not the
Same thing
only
with
one, but
nice. Yeah, yeah.
I'm
I mean,
going
and
for
you
shop
know, like
therapy on this one.
I like the complexity. I've said this before on our show. I really like the discrete TKS statements and having a lot of them. It gives us nuance in our data when we're analyzing it. But from an organization's perspective, if you have to do something enterprise wide, that's a big effort, and it aligns with regulatory compliance, right? You're going to use a workforce framework that is really simple and straightforward to adopt into the organization. So I think you're right, Brian. It's probably a number of factors kind of coalescing together there in a vehicle or a mechanism that's really easy to jump into and start driving.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
And I think
it's, go ahead, Sasha.
I was just gonna say to your point, like they're not perfect by any means. And I think that it's just a good starting point. It's a guide, it's an opportunity to have some kind of structure and standardized, language and stuff like that. So it is a really good starting point. And I think there's good elements of each of them that, we've definitely talked about before. But it is good to see that number growing because I think to your point, just a couple years ago, people still were like, "What framework? Like, which one is that?" Or like didn't even know what it was, let
Yeah,
alone
like what
adopt.
is nice? What is
Yeah,
ECSF? What's, Saudi has one too. There's
yeah, yeah. I
Sophia that's out there. So,
think
yeah,
Australia has their own.
yeah, he's
Yeah.
using Sophia. Yeah, you're starting to see more and more. I mean, what's interesting is for us, they're all talking to each other, which for me is a
Mhm.
dream come true because as you
Yeah.
can imagine, the more and more you have of these, the more and more complicated it gets. But so,
Mhm.
Sasha, one of the things I say, and I'm by far not perfect, is I always say these frameworks on both sides, they're not a
Mhm.
100% solution. To me, they're
Yeah.
an 80% solution. They're meant to be, like you noted, they're a start, not where you stop. Because what they don't
Exactly.
factor in is, okay, if I'm the medical industry, I may have certain things that are specific to my industry that's different than, say, if I'm a
Finance.
tech
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's we've been approached to say, why don't we create a nice framework just for the financial industry? And I
Mm,
know that they've been very hesitant about doing it, rightfully so, from the standpoint of, if you start creating for every industry, then where do you stop, right? Like,
mhm, mhm.
every organization's going to have something that's very specific to them, of their security practices, but also their workforce, right? Like,
Yeah.
but hey, it's kind of like we use AI to do mapping for us of these frameworks. And I always say a human still has to come in and double check that work, but it gets us up to like 80% there,
Sure.
sometimes even
Sure.
90%. Guess what? Like that DCWF, that Defense Cybersecurity Framework, that file alone of those KSATs, just to give you an idea, is like over 70 megabytes of when we have to put that together. Like, just the complications. If I had to hire a human to do that, that would be someone's full-time job for a full year. Like, we would never get anywhere with that. So it's allowing us to, it's a great start. It's not the finish. And it's interesting, like when we did the ECSF, SANS courses are often built where we teach you the skills. We're not typically, in a lot of ways, the first place that some people go to. We're kind of like,
Mhm.
okay, now you're well established. Now you're trying to become a practitioner. And we do offer some basic courses, but what we're known for is that, right? And the reason I bring that up was, when we did the mapping to the ECSF, we had to remove all the knowledge areas, because
Mm.
it suddenly would map to like 50 of our courses. And our goal was to give you like the top two or three choices. But because of those knowledge areas, it suddenly would pop in things that had nothing to do with it. So once we dropped it down to the skills and the tasks, that that framework did really, really, really well. And that's why sometimes I think it's interesting of like, hey, they're not perfect. I think if you ever talk to the folks that head up the NICE framework, they would be the first to stand there and go, look, it's a framework, right? Frameworks were never meant to be the end solution. They're
Yeah.
meant to
They're
be the
not
start.
prescriptive.
Yeah. They're meant to get you pretty far down the process, but they're not gonna be to your final step.
I'd love to take this moment, and we always have a segment on our show to share one thing briefly about something we learned over the last week or two. So I'd like to take a moment to shift into that segment of our show. And I can start it off here. I think for me, and I'm probably speaking for the whole team here, there was a lot I learned this week just by reading that report. So thank you for giving us something really easy to pull data from. And I'm actually going to steal a little nugget from that report for something that I thought was really interesting. In particular, when it goes back to the hiring authority component that you identified in the 2026 report, that nearly half of organizations find it hardest to fill expert and senior roles, followed by the mid level. And that together accounts for 72%. And I think combined with that, the hiring authority has really migrated up to leadership and to CISOs, even more so than like your traditional job manager or direct manager. So that's really highlighting some of the recruitment challenges, as the junior pipeline or talent pipeline has been kind of severed to some degree, and as that focus has really shifted in that middle zone or upper management leadership zone. So that was fascinating for me. So thank you for providing that piece. Sasha, I'm going to turn the mic over to you to go ahead and share something that you learned this week.
Yeah, and actually, I'll piggyback off you too. I did learn a lot from the report, and I think we're such big data nerds here that just having that data each and every year for the past couple of years has been just super insightful and helpful for our work. And I think related to our conversation, we were talking about like this and the study highlights it as well, this like career progression crisis. And like I said, I'm very passionate about that. But like having the data was just really helpful for me. And I think, let me see what the numbers were. So it was talking about that the concern over career advancement more than tripled this year, rising from 9% to I think 32%, and seeing that mid-career wall where 72% of recruitment difficulties were really concentrated in those critical mid to senior level roles. And I think it goes back to what I was saying is that we focus so much on that on ramp, and there's still a lot of work to be done there, especially those who are transitioning into the field and career changers. And of course, supporting those entry level folks to get the experience that they need to even just enter the field. But specifically, those mid level people are the people that I care about a lot. I care about everybody, but they have a special place in my and I think it's just really important and just solidifies, I think, for me for the work that we both do is with the career mapping and using data insights for the work that we do at SkillRex to help organizations with that, but even at SANS and being able to provide training and that skills development specifically for those mid to senior level people. And then I think even the partnerships that we both share with WESIS, I really am happy to see how they've really kind of kind of zoned in on specific, not only technical training, but professional development training for mid-level and senior level women who are trying to advance in the career. And I think just having data like this just emphasizes why the work that we all do is really important, and to make sure that we're not forgetting about those in the middle.
Yeah, no, great point. Yeah, and good tie-in with WESIS because they are seeing the same thing, and that's why they are focusing on that so much. It's fantastic. Will, let you have the next.
Yeah. So I'm gonna like just real quick, Brian, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for bringing this passion project, and bringing it back into like just it's amazing work, it's amazing data. I'm just in love with it. I'm just a huge data nerd, so I'm like this is amazing. I feel like we could probably be talking about this for hours if we wanted to because AI is a big thing. I'm like, I have a love-hate relationship with it. And so that was kind of my big stuff, right? Because again, everybody's talking, well, are you using AI for this or use it? And it's like, okay, we want to be manageable about this. Like, come on, like we don't have to use it all the time. But yeah, outside of that, um, there was a bunch of insights gleaned from this, but then also at the same time, it got me thinking about integration of AI agents into the workforce and organizations and things of that sort. And because again, we talk about a lot of these regulatory things where, talking about attribution, talking about, like where faults might lie. And all of a sudden, we're talking about AI agents and almost having them be seen and behaved as their own individuals in a way, right? Just in a workforce, people will kind of have them as that. But I think we forget that they are just as vulnerable as the systems we're trying to protect. So it's like imagine you have Dave, the employee that's like been there. He like you love Dave, but all of a sudden somebody plugs a USB into Dave, right? And all of a sudden Dave is thinking some weird things, and he's gonna burn the office down or something, right? Like very spooky stuff. Obviously, like don't have the USB ports and stuff, but when it comes to these AI agents, I was looking at there's a study that was kind of a joint study between the Technical University of Munich, the University of Lisbon, and then the INESC. And essentially, they were talking about, well, how do we protect these AI agents, right? How do we have like, provenance methods and stuff of that sort? And they were talking about there's almost this permission orchestration layer that is coupled with it's almost like policy limitations and things, right? You would have literally a separate table of like, here's our policy for AI and things of that sort. And so whenever they engage at any point with any of the systems that they are connected to, they would essentially have to run through and say, hey, is this in congruence with our policy and stuff of that sort. So I got really into that. I'm going to spare a lot of the details. It's still in this very like research phase. We're seeing that it's about like 3 times slower to run it and to get everything, you want. Obviously, there's a difference between, there's the trade-off between security and convenience here, but I think it's interesting that we're moving in this, direction of how can we almost hard code policy. And there is this, when we talk about the regulatory requirements and things, they become that much more important because they may be the things that need to be hard coded for our AI agents to work. Obviously, there's a lot of skepticism. There's a lot of people are wondering about should we adopt this kind of tech, but it's interesting to see where it goes. I don't know if anybody cares for the link or anything, but I can
We'll
send
drop
that
it in
out.
the show notes and in our
Oh
comments
yeah,
on the episode. Absolutely.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Brian, what'd you learn over the last week? I mean, you've talked to so many people and you're traveling a lot. I'm sure you can probably pull several things from your back pocket here.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess first, thank you for all your nice comments about the workforce report. Like I said, I mean, I feel like it's far from perfect, but we really do care, and it's why we developed it. So I mean, I appreciate that the comments that you made, that it was very helpful for you, and like that was the whole goal behind this, right? Is to help the whole community. I always say, this is a community I love, it's my family. So, I appreciate that. And I guess when people always talk about AI and they say, well, how does it affect cybersecurity? I always just quickly always say it raises the bar across the board. So what happens is it helps AI can take over some of the protection now, right? It helps take over the things that are a little bit more simple, but the threats also increase at the same time. So the bar just kind of goes up across the board, right? Like that's where AI, good news is it helps keep us protected. Bad news is it also creates new threats that didn't exist. I mean, this whole amount of 0 day and stuff like that is quite scary when you think about it, of how AI is now getting involved. And that's a whole nother conversation, but there was something that just happened this week that you can watch a SANS emergency webcast on, just on that particular topic. What I've learned this week, I mean, I'd love to say it would be the workforce report. Some of you probably already know, like I've seen these results now for the last 2 months, and I'm only so good at keeping my mouth shut. So I can't say that, I learned all the results these weeks, because I know that they've been sitting here for 2 months while we kept building the guide. What I thought was interesting was the US Department of War. I just came from their CIO summit, and their CIO was talking about creating a program where people would graduate, but those skills that they graduate from that program would be able to be utilized in the corporate. So not just with them, but it could also now transfer for corporate or other federal agencies. And, to me, the concept is, hey, that department has done this in other industries. Look at pilots after World War II. Where did they all come from, right? Or the medical industry. The medical industry often grew because some of the stuff that they had done. So talking about how they're applying that over into cybersecurity, I think was fascinating. And they even said, hey, we realize that AI is kind of cutting out some of the junior talent. So how can we pick some of that up? And it's interesting because I think their philosophy is, hey, once you're a member of the military, you're kind of a member for life. So if you go off to Amazon, Amazon's still a US company. I'm still doing good, but that person's still a military person. They could still come back. They could be part of the National Guard. There's means for them to still do good for us. And in some ways, we want that individual to grow their career, right? Like we realize they're not going to stay here forever, but where they're gonna end up is only gonna be good for everybody, right? And so I thought that was interesting, how to just kinda hearing that whole mindset and that philosophy out loud, right? Of, "Hey, we're here to," you know it's that whole belief sometimes, like, sometimes one of the biggest complaints of SANS, I don't know if it's a compliment or a slap in the face at the same time, is, "Hey, I don't want my folks to get certified because your certifications are so good, they're gonna walk out the door." And
Mm.
I don't know if I should say thank you or what, but, the idea is that, hey, if you also don't train them up, they're gonna walk out the door and
Yes,
you're
yeah.
gonna have problems from that anyway, right?
Yeah.
And so it's nice to see someone taking that philosophy of, hey, we have a way to be an incubator for the community, and we should take a leadership role on that.
Yeah,
So I
Yeah.
I don't
absolutely.
I would say that it will. I'm like you. I'm like learning AI every day, and it's my best friend and foe at the same time. Like I will admit, like I'm trying to think more AI-ish every day, and I will admit some days I succeed better than others.
Mhm. It's like that famous quote, and I'll paraphrase, it's better to train and have them leave than to not train and have them stay, right? So, I
Yeah.
would take it as a compliment, but, yeah, encourage them to, hey, you probably don't want them to stay either if they're not getting good training, so all right, great. Well, I think that's all we have for today. So thank you for tuning into this season 2 premiere. Today we learned that if you aren't measuring skills, you aren't managing your workforce. A huge thanks to Brian for helping us deconstruct the 2026 SANS GIAC report. If you haven't yet read through the report, the SANS 2026 Workforce Report, we'll be sure to give it a download. We'll include the link in the report, link to the report in the episode description and as comment on our postings. And we look forward to you joining us next time as we continue the journey to make the cyber workforce smarter, stronger, and more resilient. And while I have your ear for just a moment, please do follow me and my co hosts on LinkedIn. Follow Brian, Sands as well on their socials. And thank you for continuing to listen to us as we deliver important workforce updates on this show. So we look forward to seeing you next time on The Matrix.